the need for transportation for critical missions. We have the need for recreational flying. If you think about so many aspects of our daily lives that are affected or can be affected by avgas, it's going to be a bigger impact than we may first think. Not only is it important that everyone rally behind the cause, make sure we have a sensible solution for the long term that's certainly safe, but also economically viable for our communities to continue to rely on and function. I think it's a much bigger issue than the broader population understands today. Part of our challenge, I always believe in aviation, is to bring some of that message out there to those people that are stakeholders that are going to be impacted by the issue in a different way than we may think of in aviation from our perspective or from our lens. We spend a lot of time in our communities across the EA organization and our passionate membership talking about avgas. As we travel the country, and I know Craig does too, we have a lot of dialogue about avgas, but when you get out there up close and personal, when you get out in the community and you touch and you feel and you see how people are depending on aviation to get their work done, to get important things done that are good for our society and our communities, that's when the issue gets a little more real and a little bigger in scale, I think, for most of us.
Yeah, and we've got to get this right. Pete, I know you're very involved, Craig, on the process that we have in place and the working with the FAA. If either of you want to comment on that.
I'd just like to add, again, with Administrator Babbitt's help, we're able to put together this rulemaking committee that really brings industry and the government experts together along with the petroleum industry. And as Rod mentioned, the economic viability of that fuel is absolutely key. Because if all of a sudden we come up with a fuel, if we were going to forward fit all these aircraft, it wouldn't be a problem. We could produce a fuel that would work on any new production engines going forward. But we've got a huge fleet to retrofit. We've got warbirds, we've got helicopters, anything with a high compression ratio engine, we've got to take care of out there. So if we find ourselves with a fuel that requires certain chemical additives that the refiners have to build storage capacity to be able to produce this fuel, they may just walk. And if we go from 7 refiners down to 4, this whole last week I was paying between $5 and about $5.90 for 100 low-lead. If all of a sudden that becomes $7, $8 fuel because we have less refiners out there, we just lost everything. So we really have to do this carefully, and the help that we're getting from the FAA is to be able to work with EPA and say we have a process going. This is a huge, huge effort to be able to convert the industry. We need to do it slow, methodically, and get it right. And so far, I think that we've had reasonable heads in the EPA saying, FAA, you lead on this, just keep it on track, work with industry to find the solution.
And there's one other point I'd like to make, and I think it's a kind of an unintended consequence of this legal action in California. What they're proposing is that every airport that sells fuel will have to warn every citizen in California about the fact that lead is being emitted in the airplanes flying over their homes. And of course, what that's going to lead to is a public relations catastrophe for in many airports where we have been fighting for years to preserve that airport. Right. Now, we're going to be required to send out information to the community which will raise unnecessary fears and will promote an anti-airport backlash, which will affect every airport, not just little airports, but airports that we are critically dependent upon across the state of California. And organizations like Selena's and others are going to have to come up even stronger to support these local airports against what could be one of our worst public relations nightmares as this process goes forward.
You know, a lot of what we've been talking today gets to not just broad policies, but precedents that are being set, and how a precedent in one area can have an impact on all of us. Matt, you've had a number of issues representing the Helicopter Association, yep, where we have seen access to landing spaces denied. 10 years after 9/11, we still don't have helicopter flights into the District of Columbia, our nation's capital. We've seen routes challenged in New York. We know that heliports in New York are under a lot of pressure. Yep. Can you just make sure everybody is aware of some of the challenges that we're facing? Because what happens to helicopters can often be a blueprint that can be applied to fixed-wing aircraft. And again, this galvanizes our whole community.
Yeah, no, you're right on target, actually. One thing I would point out to follow up on Jim's point about state-level activities, one thing that's unique, which we found to be unbelievably egregious right now, is we have a lot of members that do aerial firefighting, and they firefight in the entire United States, wildland fires, national lands, local communities. The states have now got this brilliant concept that as the helicopters are actually fighting the fires and moving across state lines, they're declaring them foreign companies in the state. And as they pass through a state while they're fighting the fire, they're taxing them of state taxes, not only the aircraft operation, but the employees for payroll taxes. Now here are
I think
people
that goes
out.
under the category you can't make this stuff up.
No, you can't. And I heard about this problem, and I just could not get my head around it, that these ladies and gentlemen are out there risking their lives saving persons and property, and as they come across your state, you grab them and tax them. It's mind-boggling. But the other aspect of the heliport issue is we absolutely are similar to the corporate aviation. We are not that different. Having in my previous life flown and managed corporate operations that had both corporate jets and helicopters, the synergy of the problems and the complexity are there. Why we're unique? We're in your backyard. We land where you live, we land where you have your companies. You take New York City, for argument's sake, there's 3 heliports that actually serve the island of Manhattan. These helicopters, for over 50 years, have landed there safely. They conduct in excess of 100,000 operations a year. Those heliports have a safety record 6 times better than the national average. And the recent event that happened, which the unfortunate accident up there, it triggers an immediate political reaction to close the facilities, shut down the airspace. The amazing part is you have to go back almost 20, 30 years to find this accident record that you're purporting to be, I want to say, dangerous to the general population. It's not there. I think Mayor Bloomberg did an absolutely fantastic job of kind of alleviating the pressure somewhat, in the sense that he's a helicopter owner, a helicopter pilot. And he pointed out that exactly what I just said. He also pointed out an important factor, that helicopter industry contributes $150 million to the city of New York economic benefit every year, and thousands of jobs. And the other comment I liked, he said, this event just occurred. It's so unusual, the occurrence, that the press immediately blows it up and covers it. And he said, I don't actually see you covering every automobile accident because it's such a common event. I don't see you asking me to close the highways because 12 people a day get killed in the city of New York in automobile accidents. The bad part is that we also have this issue at the federal level. Senator Schumer has introduced legislation in New York, and unfortunately, Congressman Berman has now introduced the same legislation in Los Angeles. And the legislation simply states that based on nothing more than a noise complaint from the citizenry, that the FAA would have the authority and be mandated to develop restricted routes for helicopters and restricted airspace, absent any study, any historical data, any analysis that this problem really exists to begin with. And there's no quantification. We found the situation to be so bad in New York that we did an analysis. There were 10 families that generated 85% of the calls to the hotline. There was one woman who generated 55% of those calls. She had the hotline on speed dial. This is just outrageous, but the bad part of this is that this is going to set a precedent where we are subject to constraints of airspace and access to facilities based on somebody perceived noise. And we're not going to have a mechanism such as proposed rulemaking or congressional hearings. This is going to be immediate legislative reaction. The other thing to be careful of is this is going to go over into the fixed-wing community.
Yeah.
They'll start with us. They'll shut us down in urban areas. They will be at your local general aviation airport, because we have already had elected officials, even though the legislation has not been passed yet, and somebody actually told us, when it's done, I want one of those Schumer routes in my neighborhood.
Yeah. Serious challenge.
Ed, if I may just pick up on the important point that Matt made, we've been trying to get smarter about Santa Monica Airport. I suspect many NBAA members use Santa Monica Airport. I used to have a Cessna Cutlass base there, and it's changed a lot, but it's an extremely important airport for Southern California. And I know over 30 years ago, there was local opposition to that airport. But when you do some really good analysis today, what you find is that the community appreciates the airport. In fact, even a majority of the people around the airport favor the continued operation of the airport. And what they're really concerned about, more than anything else, in that district, zip code district, but also in other areas of Santa Monica, is surface congestion, development, and all the kinds of things that have affected Santa Monicans. And yet, it's that vocal minority that creates so much of the media attention. And I think Matt is exactly right, that whether it's rotor aircraft or fixed wing aircraft, these landing sites are critically important to us. And that we have to actually raise our voices, because if the other side is louder, it doesn't do any good for us to have the facts and the evidence on our side. It doesn't. I'm so glad Selena's here. When you get out and talk to mayors and to people who see the airport as a place where it stimulates economic activity, it's very encouraging. But if we don't get that information out there, those who want to claim it's a lead issue or a noise issue are going to be hurt. And so I think that we really all have to commit ourselves to that effort.
Craig, I think that is an outstanding point. We know there is a very vocal, a very organized minority that attacks general aviation. And yet we know from organizations like Selena's, these mayors, these city council people, the chambers of commerce, the League of Rural Voters, we know there is a majority that understands, appreciates general aviation. So when you look at all the things we have to do, we have to win on user fees. We have to get the avgas right. We've got to make sure they don't start doing congressional air routes. But really what we need to do is we need to change that silent majority of supporters we have into a very active, mobilized group of proponents, outspoken. And that's really what No Plane, No Gain, GA Serves America, a lot of the great work that we're doing, people like Harrison Ford, who are standing up and saying, this is good for America. You want to talk a little bit about GA Serves America and where we're going? Or, let's go ahead, Jim.
Well, I mean, I think really the point you're making is so important right now that we have got to get more active at two very important areas. We've got to get more active in dealing with Congress, because we've got to make sure that the new members of Congress, and we're having a lot of new members of Congress, as we know, coming in right now and the next, understand how important our industry is, the new senators that will be elected and so on. But even more important than that, we've got to become more active at the airport level. Every major airport that we can think of in a community, we ought to have more events where we bring together the people like here with the local community, the chambers of commerce, the universities, the safety and health folks that depend upon aviation, and get more public. And I was so impressed with what
events like the one
we
did in South Dakota, thanks to Gamma's organization.
You know, and we heard what Senator Manchin said yesterday. He said so clearly, if we don't do this, if we don't shape a community's understanding of the importance of an airport, somebody else is going to define us for us. And as we can see from what the White House does, there are plenty of people who would like to redefine who we are to their political interest. We've got to be ahead of that curve. And I think at the local level, it's a wonderful opportunity. You're going out to Napa, I know, just this weekend to do.
It's tough duty, but I'm willing to serve.